Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into Bristol-Myers Squibb, or BMY, a huge name in biopharma globally.
That's right. And we're working off a couple of key pieces of information here. We've got a pretty detailed research report from Compascope dated April 26th, 2025,
Okay.
and also the transcript from their Q1 earnings call, first quarter 2025, which just happened on April 24th.
Got it. So pretty fresh info. And our mission today really is to pull out the important stuff, what BMY actually does, who they're competing with, how they plan to grow.
What could go wrong, the risks.
Exactly. And how they've been doing lately, plus what signals you should probably keep an eye on going forward.
Sounds good. So where do we start? The core business, I suppose.
Yeah, let's do that. What's the main thrust of their operation?
Well, at its heart, Bristol-Myers Squibb is all about discovering, developing, and then actually getting innovative medicines out there for serious diseases.
Okay.
And the Compascope report really points out their focus on high-margin specialty biopharma products. So think complex treatments for tough conditions.
Right. Not just standard pills.
Yeah.
More specialized stuff where maybe the need is higher and the pricing reflects that.
Precisely. That's the strategy.
Okay, so they cover a lot of ground, it seems.
Yeah.
Can we break down the main business lines?
Absolutely. We can slice it a few ways. First up, and it's a really big one for them, is oncology.
Cancer treatments.
Exactly. Think major products like Opdivo, that's a PD-1 inhibitor, a type of immunotherapy used across a bunch of different cancers, very well known. Then there's Opdualag, which is interesting. It combines Opdivo with another immunotherapy mechanism. They've also got Abraxane, which is more of a traditional chemotherapy, Yervoy, another immunotherapy, and then Revlimid and Pomalyst, which are key in blood cancers like multiple myeloma.
Okay, so a mix of immunotherapies and other approaches in oncology. What about new stuff coming through?
Yeah, the pipeline looks active there too. They're highlighting things like iberdomide, which is a celamide, a newer class of drug. Also a CAR T therapy they got access to via Arcellx.
CAR T, that's the personalized cell therapy, right?
That's the one. Very cutting edge. And Krazati, which targets KRAS mutations that came from the Mirati acquisition. So lots happening in oncology.
Seems like it. What's next after oncology?
Then we have cardiology. The big name here is Eliquis, the anticoagulant they partner with Pfizer on. Huge drug.
Right.
And Camzyos, which treats a specific heart muscle thickening condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. In the pipeline, they've got milvexian, which is targeting a different clotting factor, factor Gia.
Interesting. Okay, oncology, cardiology. What else?
Neurology. Zeposia for multiple sclerosis is a core product there.
Mm-hmm.
But the really big news recently is Cobenfy. This came from the Karuna acquisition. Its first target is schizophrenia, but they're already testing it for agitation in Alzheimer's, bipolar disorder, even autism.
Wow, so that Karuna deal really signaled a major push into neuroscience for them.
It really did. Seems like a strategic bet to diversify beyond their traditional strengths.
Makes sense. What other areas round out the portfolio?
We've also got hematology, immunology. Key products are Reblozyl for anemia in certain blood disorders, and then two more CAR T therapies. Breyanzi for lymphoma and Abecma for multiple myeloma.
So more CAR T, building that.
Exactly. Plus Orencia, an immunosuppressant, and Sotyktu, which is a TYK2 inhibitor for psoriasis, part of their immunology focus.
Okay.
And finally, you could call out rare diseases. Camzyos fits here too, treating that specific heart condition. And they have a pipeline drug, an LPA1 antagonist, for a serious lung scarring disease called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis.
So quite a spread, if you were to group them broadly.
Yeah, you could think of it like oncology and hematology together, then cardiovascular, then neurology, neuroscience as a growing area, autoimmune and rare diseases, and maybe immunology as its own thing with Sotyktu.
Okay, that helps frame it. So with all these areas, who are they bumping up against? Who are the main competitors and how does BMY stack up?
Good question. The Compascope report lays out some key advantages for BMY. Patent protection is a big one, especially for complex biologics like Opdivo and Eliquis. That gives them a window of exclusivity.
Right, that's crucial in pharma.
Definitely. Then there's the diversified pipeline we just talked about. Oncology, immunology, rare diseases, now neuro, cardio, bolstered by all those acquisitions, spreads the risk. Established partnerships like the Eliquis one with Pfizer are also valuable. Plus, they invest heavily in R&D, they have the scale and know-how to actually sell these drugs globally, and they've been smart about focusing on higher profit areas, selling off some lower margin businesses.
Okay, sounds like a strong position in many ways. But nothing's perfect, right?
Yeah.
What are the vulnerabilities or challenges?
Oh, absolutely. There are some significant headwinds. The biggest one everyone talks about is the patent cliff.
Oh, yeah, lots of exclusivity.
Exactly. Revlimid and Eliquis, two huge revenue drivers, are facing generic competition in the next, few years, 2025 through maybe 2027, 2028. That's a massive potential hit to revenue.
That's got to be keeping them up at night.
You'd think so. Then there's competition, especially in oncology. Merck's Keytruda is a juggernaut, particularly in lung cancer, giving Opdivo a real run for its money.
Right.
Regulatory pressures are always a factor, especially since BMY gets a lot of revenue from the U.S. market. Think potential drug pricing reforms like the Medicare negotiations under the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, the IRA is a big unknown for the whole industry.
It is. And their debt load isn't insignificant, around $30 billion, mainly from acquisitions like Celgene. That limits flexibility. Plus, launching Cobenfy into the competitive neuroscience space isn't guaranteed success.
Okay, so how do they look side by side with some specific rivals?
Like Merck.
Right, comparing them. Merck, MRK, their strength is clearly Keytruda and vaccines. But the flip side is maybe over-reliance on Keytruda. BMY, as we said, is more diversified across different therapy areas.
Okay. What about Pfizer? Pfizer, PFE, strong in vaccines, obviously boosted by COVID, and they're expanding in gene therapy, mRNA, and oncology, too. Their challenge is the post-COVID revenue drop-off and their own patent expirations. Both have strong cardio franchises, but you could argue BMY's oncology history gives them broader diversification there.
Makes sense. AbbVie, they're big in immunology.
AbbVie, ABBV, yes. Huge in immunology with Humira, and now Skyrizi and Rinvoq taking over. But they've been heavily reliant on Humira, which is facing biosimilar erosion now. BMY's portfolio feels more balanced across areas, though AbbVie is also diversifying, and BMY is the newcomer in neuroscience compared to others.
Okay, Amgen.
AMGN. They're experts in specialty biologics, biosimilars too, strong in oncology and cardiovascular, maybe less geographically diverse than BMY. Their pipeline focus also differs somewhat.
And Roche, another oncology giant.
Roche, RHHBY, definite leader in oncology and diagnostics. But they also face pricing scrutiny. BMY probably has a stronger position in cardiovascular and definitely a bigger push now into neurology than Roche.
So pulling it all together, what's the verdict on BMY's competitiveness?
I'd say their position is pretty defensible overall, mainly thanks to that diversification, but the pressure from the upcoming patent losses is very real. Competitors have strongholds in key growth areas, so BMY really needs continued innovation and critically successful launches of these new drugs to maintain and grow their position.
Right, which leads us perfectly into their growth strategy. How are they planning to navigate these challenges and keep growing?
It's a multi-pronged approach. A huge piece is pipeline expansion, focusing on those areas with high unmet need. We touched on oncology with Opdualag, iberdomide, cardiovascular with milvexian, and the big bet on neuroscience with Cobenfy.
And acquisitions are feeding that pipeline, clearly.
Absolutely. Celgene was massive, but also Myocardia, which brought Camzyos, Karuna, Cobenfy, Reza Bio for radiotherapeutics, Mirati, Corzati. It's a core part of the strategy by innovation.
So bring in new drugs to replace the ones losing patents.
Essentially, yes. Mitigating those patent losses is pillar number 2. That involves maximizing the potential of newer versions of existing drugs, like Opdivo Qvantig, and launching entirely new potential blockbusters.
Okay. And they're backing this up with investment.
Definitely. R&D spending is significant, like 20-25% of revenue, heavily skewed towards oncology and neuroscience now. They're running key phase 3 studies in Alzheimer's agitation, that non-obstructive HCM, multiple myeloma, lung diseases, really trying to push those potential new treatments forward.
And they're also tightening their belts.
Correct. Operational excellence is another pillar. They announced a $2 billion cost savings program aiming for completion by 2027, trying to become more efficient.
While still funding the R&D. Tricky balance.
It is. And the final piece is a geographic diversification, trying to grow sales outside the U.S., especially with their oncology portfolio.
So what's the potential payoff here? What kind of growth are they aiming for?
The idea is sustainable growth from these high-margin specialty drugs. Cobenfy alone, some analysts think, could hit peak sales over $5 billion a year by, say, 2033. That's huge potential.
But it's not a sure thing.
No, definitely not. Achieving that depends entirely on successful clinical trials, getting regulatory approvals, and then actually convincing doctors and patients to use these new drugs, especially when there's competition or generics, and all this while managing the decline from Eliquis and Revlimid.
And how does this strategy stack up against what competitors are doing?
Well, everyone has their own focus, right? Merck is doubling down on Keytruda plus vaccines and some acquisitions. Pfizer is dealing with the COVID cliff and integrating Seagen. AbbVie is managing the Humira transition and building up Skyrizi Rinvoq. Amgen is focused on biologics and biosimilars. Roche leads in oncology diagnostics. BMY strategy seems quite focused on replacing lost revenue through both internal R&D and, very heavily, through strategic M&A, particularly pushing into new territory like neuroscience.
So assessing BMY strategy, how achievable does it look?
The potential is there, the pipeline is diversified, and drugs like Cobenfy, Milvexian, the CELMoDs, they do have high revenue potential. Neuroscience is a smart diversification move away from just oncology and cardio.
And they know how to launch drugs.
They do. They've proven launch capabilities, and they've shown they can integrate big acquisitions like Celgene, though not without challenges. So achievability seems, reasonably high if things go well. But entering totally new markets like schizophrenia with Cobenfy always has execution risks. You don't have the established relationships.
And the risks we mentioned earlier haven't gone away.
Exactly. The patent cliff is the big one, fierce competition, regulatory hurdles, especially U.S. pricing, and the debt burden. So overall, it's a competitive strategy for the long term, but it's definitely exposed to those patent expirations and regulatory constraints.
Which brings us squarely to execution risk. Even the best strategy can stumble in practice. What are the biggest potential tripwires for BMY?
Number one is absolutely navigating that patent cliff for Revlimid starting around 2025-26 and Eliquis around 2027-28. Managing that expected revenue drop is critical.
Yeah, that's a huge hole to fill.
It is. Second is just successfully commercializing the new pipeline drugs, getting market adoption for Cobenfy, Milvexian, the newer oncology drugs. It's tough in crowded markets. Execution matters immensely.
Especially in something like schizophrenia for Cobenfy, where there are established generics.
Precisely. Competition remains a risk, Keytruda in oncology, and just general competition across all their areas. Plus, as we noted, they have less history in neuroscience, which presents its own challenges.
And the regulatory environment.
Still a risk, particularly U.S. Medicare pricing negotiations. That could really squeeze margins on successful drugs down the line.
Okay. What else?
Managing the debt while pulling off the cost savings and still investing enough in R&D and launches, that's a tricky balancing act. Getting the cost structure right without hurting future growth.
So comparing these risks across the peer group, does BMY look more or less risky than, say, Merck or Pfizer?
It's always relative, isn't it? Merck has that massive Keytruda dependence risk. Pfizer has the COVID normalization plus integrating big deals risk. AbbVie has the Humira erosion risk. Amgen, maybe the risk is slower, more incremental growth. Roche has its own biologics LOEs to manage.
So where does BMY fit?
I'd put BMY's risk profile as maybe moderate to high right now, primarily because those LOEs for Revlimid and Eliquis are so significant and relatively near term. And success hinges heavily on launching new things and potentially new areas for them, like neuroscience.
But the diversification helps.
It does mitigate it compared to, say, being all in on one drug. The acquisitions have broadened their base. But yeah, the next few years are definitely crucial from an execution standpoint.
Okay, let's shift gears to what's happening right now. The Q1 2025 earnings call.
Okay.
What were the main takeaways from the recent performance and business trends?
Overall, Q1 2025 looked pretty strong. The narrative was that their growth portfolio, the newer drugs, saw double-digit sales growth, which is what you want to see.
Driving the overall results.
Exactly. They highlighted strong performance from the immuno-oncology portfolio. Breyanzi, Reblozyl, and Camzyos were all doing well. The older legacy portfolio declined, but that was expected due to generics.
Any news on the recent launches? Cobenfy.
Yes, they sounded positive on Cobenfy's early prescription trends and said feedback was favorable. Same for Opdivo Qvantig, the newer formulation. Early days, but promising signs.
And this led them to raise their guidance.
It did. Based on the strong Q1, they increased their top and bottom line guidance for the full year 2025.
Okay, What about pipeline news from the quarter? Anything significant?
Yeah, quite a bit. Approvals for Opdivo plus Yervoy in specific liver and colorectal cancers. Breyanzi got an EU approval for follicular lymphoma. Camzyos got approved in Japan and, importantly, got a favorable label update in the US that reduces some of the safety monitoring burdens, which could help uptake.
That sounds helpful for Camzyos.
It should be. Also, enrollment for the big milvexian phase 3 trial, Librexia, is complete. We won't see results until 2027, but hitting enrollment is a key step.
Any setbacks on the clinical side?
Yes, there were a couple disappointments. The Odyssey trial for Camzyos in non-obstructive HCM didn't meet its primary endpoint.
Ah, okay.
And the Arise trial for Cobenfy as an add-on therapy in schizophrenia also didn't hit its main goal.
So not all smooth sailing. How did they frame those?
Well, they provided context. For Camzyos, they suggested the non-obstructive form of the disease might behave differently. For Cobenfy's Arise trial, they said they saw encouraging trends even if it wasn't statistically significant, and stressed that their main focus remains Cobenfy as a monotherapy for schizophrenia, which is a separate set of trials.
Okay, so managing expectations there. What catalysts are coming up soon?
Key things to watch for. Phase 3 data for Cobenfy and Alzheimer's disease psychosis is expected later this year. That's a big one.
Yeah, huge potential market if that works.
Massive. They're also starting 7 new Phase 3 studies for Cobenfy by mid-year across Alzheimer's agitation and cognition and also bipolar I disorders, so really expanding the potential indications.
They're going all in on Cobenfy's potential.
Seems like it. Other pipeline milestones include starting pivotal studies for Izabren, an antibody-drug conjugate, in first-line triple-negative breast cancer, and for an androgen receptor degrader in prostate cancer. Plus, expanding the program for golcadomide in lymphoma.
And M&A. Still looking.
They said business development remains a top priority, so expect more partnerships or acquisitions potentially. And they reiterated they're on track for that $2 billion cost savings goal by 2027, hitting $1 billion by the end of this year, 2025.
Okay. Any comments on the broader environment?
Brief mentions acknowledging things like tariffs, economic uncertainty, potential FDA or HHS restructuring, but basically saying their focus is on building a resilient company to weather whatever comes.
Right. Let's hit the Q1 financials quickly. What were the headline numbers?
Okay, Q1 total revenue was $11.2 billion.
Yeah.
That growth portfolio was up 18%, Opdivo plus 12%, Reblozyl showed strong growth, Breyanzi U.S. sales doubled, international tripled, really impressive ramp-up, Camzyos nearly doubled sales.
Wow, Breyanzi's really taken off. What about Eliquis?
Eliquis was actually down 3%. They attributed that mainly to the impact of the Medicare Part D redesign in the U.S. So TIC2 showed growth, and Cobenfy brought in $27 million in its first full quarter, which they framed as strong early traction based on prescriptions.
And margins. Profitability.
Gross margin was around 73%. Operating expenses were actually lower year over year. Earnings per share came in at $1.80. They finished the quarter with $12.1 billion in cash.
Healthy cash position.
Yes, and generated $2 billion in cash flow from operations in Q1. They also mentioned being on track to pay down $10 billion in debt.
Okay, and the increased 2025 outlook, what are the key figures there?
They raised the full-year revenue guidance to $46.8 billion. Interestingly, they slightly reduced the expected decline for the legacy portfolio, now -16% to -18%, citing better-than-expected strength from Revlimid, surprisingly.
Revlimid holding up a bit better than thought.
Apparently so, for now. They maintained their gross margin guidance around 72% and operating margin around 37% for the full year.
Okay, that's a lot of recent detail. So stepping back and looking forward, what are the absolute critical things you think people should keep their eyes on regarding BMY, the real keys to watch?
All right, number one has to be pipeline success and commercialization execution. Watching those clinical trial results, milvexian, iberdomide, the CRRTs, the radiotherapeutics from Reza Bio, approvals are key, but then how well they launch them is just as important. Faster approvals or unexpected failures will swing the outlook.
Makes sense. Pipeline is future revenue.
Exactly. Second, tied to that, is the loss of exclusivity, LOE impact. How hard and how fast do Revlimid, starting soon, and Eliquis in a few years, sales drop? And can the new products ramp up quickly enough to fill that gap?
That race against time.
Precisely. Third, specifically, Cobenfy's market adoption and label expansions. How well does it do against generics in schizophrenia? Critically, can it succeed in those other big indications like Alzheimer's agitation, bipolar, maybe autism? Hitting that potential $5 billion peak sales target depends heavily on this.
Yeah, Cobenfy feels like a linchpin for their neuroscience strategy.
It really does. Fourth, the U.S. regulatory and pricing environment, especially the Inflation Reduction Act. Which drugs get negotiated? What's the impact? Could a new administration change things? High uncertainty there.
Always a factor in U.S. healthcare.
Always. Fifth, competitive dynamics, particularly in oncology. How does the Opdivo CAR-T portfolio hold up against Keytruda and others from Roche, Pfizer, Seagen? Market share battles will be intense.
Okay, what else?
Sixth, macroeconomic and global pricing trends. Are payers pushing back harder on specialty drug prices? Will economic slowdowns impact healthcare spending? That affects margins. Seventh, the cost management program. Do they successfully hit that $2 billion savings target by 2027 without damaging innovation or commercial muscle? Eighth, business development and M&A integration. How well do they fully integrate Karuna, Copenfi, and Mirati or Kazati? And can they keep finding and executing smart deals?
Seems like M&A will remain important for them.
I think so. Ninth, the potential of newer modalities like radiotherapeutics from RayzeBio. Can they build a leading position there? How does it compete with things like ADCs? And finally, 10th, global expansion. Can they successfully grow revenue significantly outside the U.S., navigating international regulatory hurdles and pricing pressures?
Okay, that's a comprehensive list of things to track. So, wrapping up our deep dive on BMY, we see a major biopharma company with a diverse portfolio, facing the significant hurdle of major patent expirations.
But tackling it head-on with an aggressive strategy focused on pipeline expansion, driven heavily by acquisitions, especially in new areas like neuroscience.
Right. Their recent performance looks solid, boosting confidence for the year, but ultimate success really hinges on executing those new launches, navigating the competitive and regulatory landscape, and managing the LOE impact effectively.
Definitely. The upcoming pipeline news, especially around Cobenfy and Milvexian, will be critical signals. And what's really striking is the strategic shift, this big bet on neuroscience, CRT, radiotherapeutics, moving beyond their historical comfort zones.
Yeah, it does feel like a potential transformation.
It does. And it makes you wonder, and maybe this is something for you, the listener, to think about. Given this pivot, these major investments in new types of treatments, how might BMY's actual identity and position in the pharma world look different 5 years from now? And could this open the door to competition from less traditional players, maybe tech companies or specialized biotechs we aren't even thinking of as direct competitors today?
That's a really interesting thought, how the competitive landscape itself might shift as BMY evolves. Definitely something to mull over.
This content is produced by Compasscope.com. For more than 1,100 public listed companies, find detailed research reports, visual mind maps, earnings call analysis, and audio discussions on Compasscope.com.